Hello, good day to one and all. This is Miss A. Krishna Sundar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KAHM Unity Women's College, Mancheri. Today, we are going to discuss the theory of Dhvani put forward by Anandavardhana, which has been discussed in the essay written by Kunyuni Raja. So in part 1, we would be dealing with a brief biography of the author, a general introduction to the theory of Dhvani, along with the remaining details from page number 1 to 4. So the entire essay consists of 15 pages, and this has been divided into 3 different parts. So here we start with part 1. So here is a brief discussion on the biography of the author Kunyuni Raja. Born in 1920 and he passed away in 2005. He is considered as an eminent Indian scholar from Kerala. He was born to Kavu Tamburati and Neelakandan Nambudiri. He was born in Thrissur district. He completed his studies at St. Thomas College and Presidency College at Madras. He attended London School of Oriental Studies, from where he took MA and 2 PhDs. His thesis was titled as Contribution of Kerala to Sanskrit Literature. He worked at Government College Chittoor and later at Department of Sanskrit, Chennai University. His wife is Shanta from Palayam family, which is again another royal family. He has penned more than 30 books and he is credited with more than 150 articles in both Malayalam and English. His great contributions were towards Indological studies. So Indological means the study relating to Indian history, literature, philosophy and culture. His major work was Indian Theories on Meaning, and his second doctoral thesis was based on this. He passed away in May 2005 at the age of 85. Now let's have a look at some of the popular works written by Kunyuni Raja. His famous works include Anandavardhana, which is a biography, Astrology and Mathematics in Kerala, The Language of Poetry, Contribution to Language Studies, Kudiyatam, and Introduction. Among these works, the one which we would be focusing on would be the very first one, which is a biographical work based on Anandavardhana. So looking at this particular book, the biography of Anandavardhana, we can understand that there are 6 chapters. Now chapter 1, Anandavardhana, his life and works. Chapter 2, Anandavardhana as a poet. Now chapter 3 is the Dhvani theory, and this is the chapter which we would be focusing on in this lecture. Now 4th chapter here is Anandavardhana and aesthetics, then comes language of poetry, and finally some concepts in Anandavardhana's theory. So before stepping into the theoretical part, there is something which I would like to convey to you, because when you learn theory, there is a different set of frameworks that you have to apply. Unlike a poetry or a novel or a short story or an essay, a by-heart study will not work when you learn the theoretical concepts. And as we all know, a critical essay is not going to be an easy kind of reading. At the same time, a theoretical essay will not provide you a lot of enjoyment when you are studying it. So the best thing here is not to learn the essay as line by line, word by word. Because if you're going to get into the depth of the meanings and the different layers involved within the critical text, it is only going to make it more complex and more obscure. So my personal suggestion to you is to understand the concept. Rather than doing a by heart study, you have to understand the basic concepts involved here. Now, once you understand the concepts, the next thing is to understand how to apply this concept within the background of literature. So, to understand the concept and in comprehending how to apply this to literature, 80% of the work is done. Now, along with that, if you can learn certain technical terms from the essay, this will be an added benefit because every theoretical essay would contain some technical terms. And if these terms are applied while you write an answer, this will definitely help you to score more marks. So please understand the concepts which are being discussed within the essay and try to understand how this is applied in literature. If you understand these two things and if you learn a few technical terms from the essay, your learning from the exam point of view will become very easy. But on the other hand, if you want to get into a detailed analysis of the text, definitely you have to read it line by line, word by word. But if your intention is just to score good marks for university exams, this would be the easiest way to attain that. So, moving on, what is this chapter about? Now, this chapter is about 4 important bullet points which are mentioned here. Now, this chapter is about the evolution of Dhvani, how Dhvani evolved through centuries. Now, this includes the different aesthetic thinkers like the Prajina school, Naena school, etc. We'll get into those details when we start analyzing the text. So, the first part here is the evolution of Dhvani. Now, the second part is what exactly is Dhvani? So, a detailed definition is given in the text. Then comes how is this Dhvani applied in poetry? Or how is it actually used within the context of poems? Now, finally, what are the criticisms against Dhvani? Now, these are the 4 important segments discussed within this essay. Now, if you can understand the answers for these 4 questions, your knowledge regarding this essay would be complete. So just understand, you have to learn the answers for these 4 questions. The evolution of Dhvani, how Dhvani evolved through centuries. Now, what exactly is this concept? What is Dhvani? Now, how Dhvani is used in poetry? And finally, what are the criticisms against Dhvani? So, if you are able to understand these 4 points, it is very easy for you to write any answer pertaining to this particular essay. So let's start. So before we start, we need to understand who is Anandavardhana, because Anandavardhana is considered as the one who actually brought into light this term Dhvani. So it is believed that he lived during 9th century AD. Anandavardhana is a Sanskrit critic who used the term Dhvani for the very first time. So this is really important. When you speak about the evolution of Dhvani, Anandavardhana's name becomes very, very important. He mentioned it in his primary text, Dhvanyaloka. So these are some key points that you have to remember when you are going to attempt an answer from this area. He describes Dhvani as suggestion, or it is otherwise known as the soul of poetry. Now, Dhvani suggests hidden meaning. So, suggested meaning is Dhvani. Hidden meaning is Dhvani. So, Dhvani is considered as the soul of poetry. Now, if we look at the evolution of Dhvani, According to the Prajina school, the aesthetic thinkers believed that a poetry is an ordinary situation idealized by the poet. So, this isn't something new because we have already learned these concepts when we discussed Aristotle, Greek theatre, etc., when ordinary situations are idealized into an art. So, the very same thing is happening here. Now, this external situation is usually described in words. That is Vakya. So there are so many Sanskrit oriented terms coming within the essay, and please remember these terms. As I have mentioned before, knowing a few technical terms from the essay is really beneficial. Thus, this method by which this is communicated to the reader through linguistic expression is known as Vachana. So the usual description in words, it is known as Vakya, but when this is coming as a method by which this is communicated to the reader through linguistic expression, it becomes Vachana. Thus, the beauty of a poem is dependent on the beauty of its expression. So, the beauty here is not something which is related with the situation or the context from which the poem originates, but it is totally dependent on the way in which it is expressed to the reader. Now, expression is constituted with two aspects: word, that is Shabda, and explicit meaning, which is known as Vakyartha. So please remember these technical terms. Now each of these concepts will have further elements like Guna, Dosha, and Aalamkara. Now Guna is excellence, Dosha is defect, and Aalamkara is embellishment, something which is going to be very decorative or something, as we normally say, flowery kind of language. So both Shabda and Vakyartha, both of these would be having Guna, Dosha and Aalamkara. So respectively it would be excellence, defect and embellishment. So to put it into a diagrammatic format, poetry consists of Vakya and Vachana. Now from Vakya it moves on to Shabda, and from Vachana it moves on to Vakyartha. Now let it be Shabda or Vakyartha, in both these aspects you can find Guna, Dosha and Aalamkara. When a poetry is expressed through words, the presence that lends charm to the poetry is known as Guna, and those that mask the quality or the beauty of the poem is known as Dosha. So this is something which we all know. Guna means that is excellence, and Dosha means something that is creating a break for the beauty. Now, the presence of Guna and the absence of Dosha ensures charm, which is known as Shobha. So, this is a technical term, and thus makes it a source of delight. Now, there were difference of opinions among the scholars themselves regarding the definition of Aalamkara or embellishment. Now, Prajina school focused on poetic expression consisting of words and their direct meanings. So, though Prajina school discussed poetry, their key focus was on direct meanings. So they are not talking about indirect meaning, they are talking about direct meanings. And remember, this direct meaning is closely connected with Prajina school. And the term Dhvani was never used during this period of Prajina school. Now moving on to Naena school. So both Prajina and Naena school, they consist of aesthetic thinkers. Now it is at the edge of this Naena school that Anandavardhana comes to limelight. Now Anandavardhana suggested that poems which have emotion, now he uses the term bhava for this. So poems which have got bhava as its theme is considered superior. So Prachina school thinkers believed that poetry can be direct. But in Naveena school, Anandavardhana believed that poems should have bhava. A poetry cannot be purely expressed in words, and hence a poet will have to use indirect methods for expression. So, this is how, or this is a point where Naveena school takes a sudden leap because Prajina school thinkers believed that poetry can be direct communication. But Naveena school thinkers believed that it should be using indirect methods for expression. Thus, the poet should be capable of producing the exalted delight in the reader. Now, this exalted delight is actually rasa, that is the aesthetic experience that you feel. Now, language has the power to communicate through suggestion. So it is from Naveena school onwards the term suggestion comes. So suggestion is otherwise known as indirect method of expression. Now Dhvani is a real core of poetic method, the Atman. So Atman, this is a term that Anandavardhana uses and he says Kavyasya Dhvani because the Atman of Kavya is actually Dhvani. The meaning suggested by words is called Vyangyartha. Now, Vyangyartha is otherwise known as Dhvani. So, the suggested meaning or indirect meaning, this is what you call as Vyangyartha and this is otherwise known as Dhvani. It is very different from words communicated directly as mentioned by Prajina school because for them it was direct communication and this is known as Vakyartha because what the words imply, the meaning would be the same. But Vyangyartha means you can read between the lines. You can find millions of interpretations and possibilities. So, looking at this point, the Prajina school focused only on the body of poetry, while the Naveena school wanted the readers to go deep into the poem and to see the hints and clues to unearth the suggested meaning. So, Prachina school here used the method of direct expression. So that is direct kind of communication where words are used. Whereas Naveena school, they employed a method where indirect or suggestive kind of communication happened. So the suggested meaning or indirect meaning, this gave an opening to millions of possibilities and interpretations. Whereas with Prajina school, this was very direct and therefore meaning was very confined. So now let's take an example, direct communication and indirect communication. Now let's look at this example, direct communication. My name is John. Now this is very, very direct because my name is John means my name is John. There is no possible way of interpreting it or there is no possible way of analyzing it in depth. On the other hand, if you are talking about indirect kind of communication, which is otherwise known as Vyangyartha or suggested meaning, or you can even call it as Dhvani, as the term suggests. The best example here would be a poetic line from the great Victorian poet, My Last Duchess, written by Browning. Now, Browning here says in his poem, My Last Duchess, I gave commands and all smiles stopped together. I'm sure many of you might be familiar with this popular poem written by Browning. It is about a duchess who was killed by her husband. But if you look at these two lines, I gave commands. This is what the Duke is suggesting, okay? I gave commands, all smiles stopped together. So I gave commands. The command here is given by the Duke. All smiles stop together. Now this is about the Duchess. All smiles stop together. So in turn, the suggested meaning here is that the Duke gave commands and the Duchess got killed. So these two lines, they are actually speaking about a murder. But look at these lines. If you're going to recite it for the first time to a stranger, it's very difficult for the stranger to understand the indirect or the suggested meaning which is hidden here. I gave commands and all smiles stopped together. Now, with these two lines, you get millions and millions of possibilities. You can understand the character of the Duke. You can understand the nature of the Duchess. You can understand what happened here. So, millions of possibilities and millions of meanings can be analyzed here. Now, this is what you call as the beauty within a poem. Now, this is one of the most beautiful poems written by Browning, and the beauty comes here because of this indirect kind of communication. If you look at the lines here, no negative words are actually used. Killing, murdering, nothing of these sort can be seen here. But the poet, through the Duke, is actually talking about a murder. Now, this is what you call as indirect meaning or suggested meaning. Now, this kind of a meaning was explored only by the thinkers of Naena School, and this began with Anandavardhana. Now, Naena School gave more importance to inner meaning rather than mere expression. The final question is not whether the expression is beautiful or not, but if the expression is adequate enough to lead the reader to the inner meaning. Now, finally, what should be the end result of a poem? The end result is again rasa, the aesthetic experience that you feel when you go through a poetry. So, Anandavardhana says that this aesthetic experience can happen only if Dhvani is applied in poetry. So the quality here is assessed not by the method of expression or whether the expression is beautiful or not, but the quality here is assessed by adequacy. And he uses the term auchitya for this. So Shabda and Vakyartha. Now these were the terms to which the Prajina school thinkers belonged to. So Shabda and Vakyartha are no more valuable and are only subordinate to Vyangyartha or Dhvani. So that is suggested meaning. So direct meaning is actually a subordinate when we think about the indirect or suggested meaning. Now moving on to the evolution of Dhvani. Dhvani arose as a result of transmitting the emotional aesthetic experience to its reader. Now Anandavardhana was the first author to give an independent special status for Dhvani through his work Dhvanyaloka. So these are all points which we had already discussed. Earlier writers including Bharata, who wrote Natya Shastra, mentioned the importance of rasa. Now this was continued by Bhattalollada and Shankuka. But none of these writers acknowledged Dhvani in their writings. So many writers spoke about rasa, many writers and thinkers from Prajina school spoke about rasa, but none of these writers mentioned Dhvani in their writings. So it was Anandavardhana who started a discussion on Dhvani for the very first time in the history of these aesthetic thinkers. Now moving on, once again reminding you the book written by Anandavardhana, Dhvanyaloka. So here Dhvani, which means suggested meaning, and Aloka means luster. Luster is glitter. The luster of suggested meaning. Now this is what the title means. So Dhvani literally means sound, but the meaning that Anandavardhana tried to attach with Dhvani was different. So Dhvanya Loka means the luster of suggested meaning. Both poeticians and dramaturgists criticized Dhvani. So here comes a lot of criticisms against Dhvani. So if you look at the chapter, if you look at the essay, all these points are interconnected and they stay as a mixed up kind of writing. So, here, if you look at the criticisms, we can see that none of the writers at this point of time agreed with the concept of Anandavardhana. Pratiharendra Raja denied the independent status of Dhvani by including it in the figures of speech. Kuntaka tried to include it in the concept of Vakrokti. Now, Vakrokti means the striking modes of expression. So, see, different writers acknowledged Dhvani, but none of these writers were ready to give an independent status for Dhvani, just like Anandavardhana did. So, Kuntaka said that it is a part of the concept of Vakrokti. Thus, Dhvani was reduced just to the outer element of poetry. Now, Bhattanayaka explained it in two terms, Bhavakatva and Bhojakatva. I'm sure you might be familiar with these terms if you have gone through the theory of rasa, because these are two concepts which will help the readers to get into the experience of rasa, the aesthetic experience. Now, Bhavagatva is considered as a spiritual function, and Bhojakatva is something that is related with how this aesthetic experience can be generated in the audience. So, Bhattanayaka explained it in connection with these two concepts. Now, Mahima Bhatta described Dhvani just as an inference. So, this is otherwise known as Anumana in Sanskrit. But a century after Anandavardhana, it was Abhinavagupta who described Dhvani as an indisputable method of artistic communication. So, apart from Anandavardhana, it was only Abhinavagupta who was ready, who was willing to give an independent status for Dhvani, because all the other writers considered it as an element which could be connected with some other parts of poetic writing. So, if you look at the history of Dhvani, this is how it goes. The three broad periods in Indian philosophy. Now, the first period is 1st century BC to 9th century AD. Now, this is considered as a period of formulation. The formulation of the concept of Dhvani. Now, Bharata's rasa came during this period, and it is at the narrow edge of this period that Anandavardhana comes with the concept of Dhvani. Now, the second period, from 9th century to 11th century, this is known as a period of consolidation. Because this was a period when there came a lot of criticisms against the concept or the independent status of Dhvani. Now, from the third period, 11th century to 17th century, this was a period in which many writers started exposing the relation among bhava, dhvani and rasa. So, dhvani was getting a more independent status in relation with the concept of rasa during this period. So, this is how you can categorize the three broad periods in Indian philosophy in connection with the concept of dhvani. So, with this we come to the end of part 1. Now, this will be continued in part 2. So, thank you very much for your patient listening. If you have got any doubts or if you need more explanation, please do not hesitate to connect with me in my email ID. So, thank you very much. Thank you.